The air at the farm auction was thick with despair, but one man was smiling. He was using the bank's cheap money to buy up his neighbor's ruined life, mocking the old-timer who refused to touch a dime of debt. But within 5 years, the music stopped. And when the brutal reckoning arrived, only one of them had a chair left to sit on. The air at the Peterson farm auction hung thick and heavy, a humid August cocktail of diesel exhaust, stagnant sweat, and unexpressed despair. It was 1975, a time when the horizon still looked vast, but the margins were already beginning to tighten like a noose. Jedodiah Stone stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, the faded denim of his work shirt worn thin and white at the elbows. He had not driven his old pickup over to this side of the county to buy. He was here to watch a ghost story unfold in broad daylight, to witness the quiet, systematic dismantling of a neighbor's life. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant rose and fell, a strange, hypnotic song of financial ruin that echoed off the weathered red siding of the big barn where 3 generations of Petersons had milked their dairy cows. To Jed, each strike of the gavel sounded like a hammer hitting a coffin nail. He watched as items his own father had probably borrowed once went under the hammer for pennies on the dollar. A set of rusted crescent wrenches, a hay rake with a familiar, crude weld on the main axle, and an old Farmel tractor that had cultivated the field next to his for 30 seasons. Right in the middle of the shifting crowd, holding court like a king in a freshly starched western shirt, stood Richard Miller. Rich, as he insisted everyone call him, leaned casually against the polished fender of his brand-new Ford Ranger pickup, a slight, knowing smirk playing on his lips. He wasn't just observing the tragedy. He was orchestrating his own advancement from it. He had already bought the Petersons' best bottomland, the 160 acres of dark, rich loam that bordered his own expanding territory. He had outbid the locals without even looking up, using a casual flick of his index finger to signal that his pockets were deep and his ambitions were absolute. Rich saw the soil not as a sacred birthright to be tended, but as an aggressive asset on a corporate balance sheet, establishing a quiet war between his modern empire of debt and Jed's stubborn devotion to the old ways. The boundary line between the Stone farm and the Miller expanding empire was marked by more than just a sagging, barbed wire fence. It was the dividing line between 2 entirely different kingdoms of thought. Jedodiah farmed the 200 acres his grandfather had broken from the prairie homestead, and he did it with a John Deere 4010 that his father had bought used back in the late 60s. Its classic green paint had faded to a pale, chalky mint under the relentless glare of the Iowa sun, and the open station offered no protection from the dust or the wind. For planting, Jed relied on a 6-row international cycloplanter that was already a decade old, its fiberglass hoppers stained by years of seed treatment. His operational philosophy was simple, hammered into his character by a father who had survived the Dust Bowl firsthand and carried the scars of that black suffocating sky into his grave. In the Stone household, debt was treated like a profound moral failing. If you could not count the cash into a man's hand, you simply could not afford the iron. Richard Miller looked at Jed's pristine balance sheet and saw nothing but a dinosaur waiting for the tar pits. Rich was the vanguard of the new frontier, a man who spoke the language of the city, leverage capital, tax depreciation, and cash flow. He didn't wait for a good year to buy equipment. He used the bank's money to stay ahead of the curve. He had been the first in the Tri-County area to purchase a John Deere 4430 equipped with a luxury Soundguard cab, a machine so quiet and heavily insulated that you could listen to the AM agricultural reports without hearing the roar of the turbocharger. To Rich, farming was a race of scale. You either grew aggressively or you withered away. He viewed the land as a factory floor and the bank as his primary business partner, completely dismissing Jed's traditional anti-debt ethic as a sentimental relic of a bygone era that would soon be crushed by the machinery of progress. As the crowd began to thin and the auctioneer's voice drifted toward the smaller tool lots, Rich Miller sauntered across the packed dirt toward the back of the barn. His polished leather boots stood out in sharp contrast against the dust, completely unmarred by the grease and mud that coated Jed's heavy work shoes. Rich stopped a few feet away, pulling a fresh pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket and tapping it against his thumb. "Quiet afternoon for you, Jed," Rich said, his voice carrying a smooth, patronizing weight. "I figured you might try to pick up some of that extra pasture land. A man can't expect to make a decent living on a meager 200 acres anymore. The world is changing. It's get big or get out." Jed kept his gaze fixed on the empty kitchen window of the Peterson farmhouse, his expression unreadable. "Just watching," he replied flatly. Rich chuckled, a dry, humorless sound that drifted off into the hot August humidity. "Watching doesn't pay the taxes, old friend. The banks are practically begging us to take their money right now. Capital is cheap, and the returns are there if you have the stomach for it. You ought to think about trading that open station 4010 for a new, articulated four-wheel drive. Farm fence row to fence row. Let the bank carry the risk while you build the future." Jed shifted his weight, his voice remaining low and steady, though his words carried the absolute weight of bedrock. "My 4010 is completely paid for, Rich. It starts up every single morning, and when I turn the key off at night, I don't owe a stranger a dime for the hours it worked. That's all the liberty I need." Rich clapped Jed on the shoulder with condescending familiarity. "Suit yourself, Jed. But when you're out there choking on dust and baking in the sun, and I'm sitting in a climate-controlled cab listening to the ball game, don't say the world didn't give you a fair warning." He walked away toward his gleaming truck, leaving Jed alone with a bitter taste of his neighbor's ruin. Driving home in the cab of his dusty Chevy C10, Jed watched the sprawling, fence-to-fence fields of the county flash past. The psychological weight of Rich's words pressed hard against his chest. It was a sobering realization. The economic tide was rising rapidly, and the world was turning into a place that considered his quiet self-reliance to be a foolish, outdated whim. The following Saturday, Jedodiah drove 2 counties over to Henderson's salvage yard, a sprawling graveyard of agricultural ambition tucked away in a low-lying valley. He was hunting for an obsolete hydraulic valve for his planter, a piece of iron the local dealership had long since declared dead and buried. Henderson's was a place where forgotten dreams went to rust, a silent congregation of crooked rows where faded green, cracked red, and blistered orange machinery bled into the tall, choking prairie grass. It was an atmospheric monument to busted knuckles and foreclosure notices, where the heavy scent of old gear oil and damp earth hung constantly in the air. He found his valve near the back fence, buried beneath the skeleton of a wrecked cultivator. But as he stood up, wiping his greasy hands on a rag, a massive silhouette looming over a row of dead tractors caught his eye. Its sheer size defied belief. Sitting deep in the weeds was the carcass of a giant, a Massey Ferguson 760 combine. When new, these machines were the undisputed titans of the harvest, powered by a ferocious Perkins V8 diesel engine built to swallow entire horizons. This particular unit, however, was a monument to neglect. The massive tires were flat, sun-cracked, and sinking into the dirt. Its heavy sheet metal was dented and bleeding rust from every seam, and a dense tangle of wild mustard grew straight through the feeder house. A hand-painted sign on the grain tank simply read, "As is, $800. Jed walked a slow, deliberate circle around the mechanical ruin, his boots crunching on shards of broken cab glass. The interior was a disaster. The seat was torn to shreds by rodents. The gauges were milky and cracked, and the wiring under the dashboard resembled a rotting rat's nest. Yet, where any sane man would have seen a worthless pile of scrap metal destined for the furnace, Jed's eyes lingered on the structural truth of the machine. He saw a massive hydrostatic transmission buried beneath the grime. He saw a towering 20-foot grain head that could cut his time in the field completely in half, backed by heavy-duty final drives, and a mainframe constructed like a battleship. Underneath the superficial ruin and the weathering of time, it possessed remarkably good bones. It was a gamble, a massive, back-breaking, all-consuming gamble, but it was a way to fight the rising tide without bowing to the bank. Jed stepped into the greasy, smoke-filled office of Henderson's salvage yard, where the air smelled of stale tobacco and decades of industrial grease. Old man Henderson sat behind a cluttered desk, his spectacles sliding down his nose as Jed pulled a thick, weathered roll of cash from his pocket. "I'll give you $700 cash right now for that old Massey combine in the back," Jed said, his voice carrying a steady determination that belied the knot in his stomach. Henderson looked up, eyeing the cash, and then looking Jed square in the face. "Son, you're buying yourself a world of unmitigated trouble. That engine is seized solid, from what my boys tell me, and parts for those early hydrostatics will bleed you dry. You'd be better off buying scrap iron by the pound." "I'll take my chances," Jed replied flatly, counting the green bills out onto the laminate counter. The following Tuesday, a local heavy hauler brought the beast home. Watching the monstrous, rusted silhouette of the Massey 760 back down the gravel lane on a lowboy trailer was a sobering sight. Sitting in the middle of Jed's neat, modest farmyard, it looked even larger, more broken, and infinitely more hopeless than it had in the salvage yard. As the truck driver was unchaining the massive wheels, a familiar hum echoed down the road. Rich Miller's shiny new pickup slowed to a crawl, then turned sharply into the lane, kicking up a dramatic plume of white limestone dust. Rich stepped out of the air-conditioned cab, his immaculate western boots stepping carefully over the gravel. He walked a slow circle around the derelict combine, letting out a low, incredulous whistle before bursting into a full-throated, mocking laugh. "Jesus, Jed, what in God's name is this?" Rich shouted, gesturing wildly at a rusted side panel. "You actually paid real money for this junk? It belongs in a museum of agricultural failure. You're going to try and farm with a mountain of scrap iron." "She's got good bones, Rich," Jed mumbled, his face burning with a mixture of quiet fury and deep embarrassment. "She's got a boat anchor for an engine and a frame that's ready to snap in two," Rich shot back, his tone sharp and patronizing. "You'll spend every dime you have and every single hour of your winter freezing in the shop trying to make this corpse breathe. Come next fall, you'll still be out here trying to scratch your crop out with that old pull-type machine. You're a fool, Jed. A sentimental, stubborn fool." Rich climbed back into his truck, aggressively spinning his tires in the gravel as he tore away. He left Jed standing completely isolated in a choking cloud of dust and humiliation, staring up at the monumental mountain of rust he had just chained his entire future to. That first winter was a relentless trial by iron and ice. Jedodiah pushed the monstrous Massey Ferguson deep into his machine shed, where its massive frame took up nearly every square foot of available space. The shed was a simple, uninsulated pole barn with a hard-packed dirt floor that held the freezing temperature of the earth like a block of granite. The only source of warmth was a kerosene-powered salamander heater that roared like a jet engine and smelled of an oil refinery, barely managed to take the biting edge off the Iowa cold that seeped through the thin tin walls. His first and most formidable task was the engine. The Perkins V8 was seized solid, fused together by years of standing open to the elements. Jed spent a grueling week soaking the cylinders with a homemade concoction of acetone and transmission fluid, pouring the pungent mixture down the exhaust stack and waiting for it to work its way past the frozen piston rings. The sharp smell of the chemicals clung to his skin and heavy woolen clothes long after he left the shop. On a bitter morning in late January, he placed a 4-foot breaker bar onto the main crankshaft bolt. He slipped a long length of iron pipe over the handle for maximum leverage, his heavy work boots slipping precariously on the frozen dirt floor. Jed leaned into the tool with every ounce of his weight, his muscles straining against the cold metal. Nothing moved. He reset his stance, closed his eyes, and gave a violent, desperate heave. There was a sudden, sickening crack that echoed off the tin ceiling. It wasn't the sound of the engine breaking free, but the half-inch drive of his breaker bar shearing completely in two. The heavy pipe flew from his hands, clanging loudly against the far wall, while Jed's momentum sent him crashing into the sharp edge of the frame. He stood there panting in the freezing air, his knuckles split open and bleeding onto the greasy engine block. Discouragement settled over him like a suffocating shroud. Rich Miller's mocking laughter seemed to echo in the rafters of the dark barn. Defeated and shivering, he walked back to the farmhouse, where Martha was waiting with a hot, steaming mug of coffee. She took one look at his stained hands, the fresh blood on his chin, and the hollow exhaustion in his eyes. "No luck?" she asked softly, wrapping a warm towel around his hands. "It's frozen tighter than a drum, Martha," Jed muttered, staring down at the kitchen table. Maybe I am the fool everyone says I am." Martha placed her hand over his, her gaze fiercely steady. "You are the most stubborn, resilient man I know, Jedodiah Stone. You've never walked away from a hard day's work in your entire life. Don't you dare start now." Her quiet, unyielding faith was the only fuel he had left, completely rekindling his resolve for the long battle ahead. The next morning, before the winter sun could even crack the eastern horizon, Jed was back in the cold sanctuary of the machine shed. He had resolved that there was no easy way out. The massive Perkins V8 would have to come apart piece by piece, pulled entirely from the frame. Pulling an engine of that scale was traditionally a job for 3 grown men equipped with hydraulic lifts. But Jed had only himself, a manual chain hoist, and an unyielding will. He rigged the hoist to a heavy oak beam in the barn ceiling, testing the knots before committing to the weight. It took 2 full days of wrestling with the greasy 3/4-ton beast, clearing a path through tangled linkages and stiff hydraulic lines, his frozen fingers fumbling with cold wrenches until the massive iron heart finally swung free of the combine's chassis. Then came the agonizing process of the teardown on a makeshift stand he had welded from scrap iron. Every single bolt fought him with the stubbornness of buried stone. He used an acetylene torch to heat the frozen fasteners, watching the metal turn a dull cherry red in the dim light of the shed before shocking them with splashes of cold water to break the ancient bond of rust. More often than not, the brittle metal would fail anyway, snapping off flush with the block. The failure meant hours of meticulous, backbreaking work, drilling out the hardened steel stubs with a hand drill and carefully running a tap down the ruined holes to restore the threads. Each broken bolt felt like a small, infuriating defeat designed to break his spirit. The true devastation, however, waited until he finally pried the first heavy cylinder head away from the block. He held his breath as the iron parted, but what he found underneath made his stomach drop. Water had cascaded down the open exhaust stack during its years of neglect in the salvage yard. 2 of the center cylinders were completely filled with a solid, petrified mass of orange rust, fusing the heavy pistons permanently to the cylinder walls. This wasn't a temporary seizure that could be lubricated or pressed loose. The iron had oxidized into a singular, solid block of ruin. As he scraped at the scale, a chunk of the internal cylinder wall flaked away like wet cardboard, revealing a deep, unrepairable fracture. The block was dead. It was a catastrophic, absolute setback that would have forced any ordinary man to throw down his tools, call the scrap dealer, and surrender to the mounting laughter of the county. Refusing to let the ruined iron dictate his failure, Jed spent 3 days on the kitchen telephone, tracking down a replacement across 4 states. He spoke to salvage yards from Missouri to the Dakotas, his voice flat with exhaustion as he repeated the same specification, a Perkins V8 Model 540. Most operators simply laughed or told him those old power plants had gone to the furnace years ago. Finally, a yard in southern Minnesota confirmed they had one sitting in a burned-out white tractor. The block was intact, but they offered no guarantees. Jed borrowed a neighbor's heavy trailer and spent 2 grueling days on winter roads to retrieve it, the cost of the donor block completely draining the cash reserves he had saved from his last modest harvest. Returning to the dim light of the pole barn, Jed began the slow, meticulous craftsmanship of building one reliable engine out of 2 separate ruins. He took the forged crankshaft from his original engine and sent it to a machine shop to be turned and polished. Working through February and into March, his life shrank to the radius of a single hanging light bulb. He measured tolerances with a micrometer, checking clearances against a greased shop manual he had ordered through the mail. He honed the cylinders of the new block himself, the rhythmic, scraping hiss of the tool creating a steady beat in the cold silence of the shed. He replaced every gasket, every seal, and every bearing by hand, ensuring absolute precision. While Jed labored in isolation, his reputation as the county eccentric grew at the local co-op coffee shop. The gossip was merciless. Neighbors huddled over steaming mugs, whispering about the lights burning in the stone barn at midnight. They joked that Jed was playing doctor with a junk pile and would go entirely broke before the machine ever turned a wheel. Rich Miller would simply sip his coffee, smiling broadly for the crowd as he remarked that pride was an expensive commodity, and some men had to learn the hard way. Jed heard the whispers when he went to town for parts, but he kept his head down and his hands greased, completely focused on resurrecting the sleeping titan. The global economic landscape shifted violently as the mid-1970s arrived, bringing a sudden, intoxicating rush of prosperity to the heartland. In what the newspapers called the Great Grain Robbery, the Soviet Union secretly purchased a massive portion of the United States wheat and corn reserves to cover their own catastrophic crop failures. Overnight, commodity prices shot into the stratosphere. Corn values tripled, and soybeans followed the same vertical trajectory. Suddenly, farming was transformed from a modest, generational struggle into an aggressive gold rush, and the sudden influx of rapid cash flow seemed to completely validate Richard Miller's leveraged lifestyle. With crop profits soaring, the massive monthly payments on Rich's borrowed empire suddenly looked like absolute genius. The local banker, who had once exercised caution, now greeted Rich at the front door with an open checkbook and a wide smile. Land values exploded on paper, providing Rich with endless fresh collateral to borrow against, and he used it to embark on a spectacular buying spree. He acquired another 200 acres of premium ground, traded his newer John Deere for a massive, articulated Steiger Bearcat four-wheel drive tractor, and built a gleaming steel machine shed that completely production dwarfed Jed's weathered timber barn. He even tore down his family's traditional farmhouse to erect a sprawling, modern brick ranch home with a two-car garage. He was the undisputed poster child of the new agricultural frontier, a man who had successfully leveraged the future to conquer the present. Meanwhile, back in the quiet isolation of his dirt floor shed, Jedodiah Stone was still patiently wrestling with the past. On a crisp, clear April morning, as the damp earth began to thaw, he climbed the rusted ladder into the dusty cab of the Massey Ferguson 760. He had spent the previous week meticulously reconnecting fuel lines, bleeding the heavy injection pump, and double-checking his hand-wired electrical circuits. Jed turned the ignition key. The heavy starter motor groaned under the strain, turning the massive V8 over once, then twice, accompanied by a tense silence. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, coughed a dense cloud of black soot from the straight pipe, and caught with an immense, deafening roar. The raw, unmuffled V8 bellow shook the very foundations of the timber barn, sending birds scattering from the rafters. Jed sat in the vibrating cab for a long, quiet moment, his hand resting gently on the throttle, feeling the powerful pulse of the resurrection in his very bones. When the autumn of 1976 arrived, bringing with it a heavy, golden crop, Jed rolled his patched-up, fiercely independent Massey Ferguson 760 out into the open sunshine. The machine was a visual testament to raw survival. Its massive body was a mismatched patchwork of faded original red, gray primer, and heavy steel plates riveted over old rust holes. As it lumbered down the gravel road toward his first field of soybeans, neighbors slowed their trucks to stare open-mouthed at the loud, mechanical monstrosity. Every time Jed advanced the throttle, the rebuilt Perkins V8 bellowed a dark plume of smoke into the clear autumn sky, announcing its presence across the entire valley. It was far from a smooth maiden voyage. 2 days into the harvest, a high-pressure hydraulic hose burst with a sharp report, showering a wide swath of soybeans in boiling oil and leaving Jed drenched in black fluid. Later that week, a loud, metallic shriek signaled that a critical bearing in the feeder house had collapsed. Instead of panicking or calling an expensive dealership service truck, Jed crawled into the dust beneath the machine with his wrenches, working late into the night by the yellow glare of his pickup's headlights to press a standard replacement into place. Despite these mechanical trials, the resurrected Titan proved its true worth. The giant 20-foot grain had cut through the crops with an insatiable appetite, swallowing acres in a single pass and cutting Jed's total time in the field completely in half. When he finished his own fields, he used the remaining time to do custom combining for a struggling neighbor, bringing in a significant stream of extra cash. As the high grain prices of the boom era continued to fill his pockets, Jed resisted the temptation to follow the crowd into expansion. While Rich Miller was using his windfall profits to secure even larger banknotes, Jed walked into the local credit association with his boots dirty and his cash in hand. He systematically paid off his annual operating loan, cleared the outstanding balance on his Chevy truck, and purchased his seed and fertilizer for the coming spring outright. By the time the snow fell, Jed Stone had eliminated every remaining operational debt, anchoring his family on solid, unyielding ground. By the autumn of 1978, Jedodiah Stone stood on completely debt-free land, a rare and quiet island of solvency in a vast sea of speculative expansion. All around him, the county was drunk on the illusion of permanent prosperity. Land prices had soared to unthinkable heights, and his neighbors continued to borrow heavily against their paper wealth to acquire more acreage and grander machinery. To the community, Jed's refusal to expand looked like paralysis, a stubborn refusal to participate in the golden age of modern farming. The underlying truth of their vulnerability became clear one afternoon when Jed drove his truck to the local feed store to pick up salt blocks for his cattle. Sitting on a weathered timber bench out front was Gus, an elderly, silver-haired farmer who had lost everything in the Great Depression and spent the rest of his life studying the shifting moods of the soil and the markets. Gus watched in silence as Rich Miller roared past the store in a gleaming, brand-new Lincoln Continental, the latest trophy in his leverage collection. Gus shook his head slowly, carefully packing dark tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. "Look at that, Jed," the old man said, his voice a gravelly, low whisper. "That is exactly what happens when money gets cheap and credit flows like water. Men entirely forget what a dollar is actually worth." "He's running a massive operation," Jed noted quietly. "He is building a fragile house of cards on borrowed time," Gus countered, striking a match that flared bright in the shadow of the porch. He puffed the pipe to life, filling the heavy air with the sweet scent of cherry tobacco. "I saw this exact same madness back in the late 20s. Everyone thought they were financial geniuses. The banks were handing out loans like candy at a county parade. Then, overnight, the music stopped. There is always a brutal reckoning for debt, son. When the music stops this time, you had better have a chair to sit on. And that chair," he added, pointing the stem of his pipe firmly at Jed, "it had better be paid for." That evening, Jed stood on his back porch, looking out across the twilight. In the far distance, the brilliant halogen yard lights of Rich Miller's sprawling farmstead cut through the darkness like a glittering fortress of progress. Inside the kitchen, the radio news crackled, reporting that a man named Paul Volcker was taking over the Federal Reserve with a strict mandate to aggressively fight inflation by raising interest rates. Jed didn't understand all the complex mechanics of central banking, but as he stood in the quiet dark, Gus's warnings echoed in his mind like an ominous drumbeat. The music was still playing across the valley, but for the first time, Jed could hear it starting to slow down. The music did not simply slow down. In the blistering summer of 1980, it stopped with a horrifying metal-on-metal screech. A severe, unforgiving drought descended upon the Midwest, locking the heartland in a suffocating grip of heat and dust. July arrived with a brassy, cloudless sky and a sun that felt like a physical weight pressing down on the dying earth. The corn, which should have been dark green and shoulder-high, stood stunted, pale and brittle, its leaves curling inward during the heat of the day like hands folded in a desperate prayer for rain that never came. The soybean pods were thin and sparse, the few beans inside small and hard as gravel. For Jedodiah Stone, the drought was an undeniable hardship that meant a smaller harvest and lower income, but his low overhead resilience protected him from ruin. His costs were fixed and entirely minimal. He had purchased his diesel fuel and seed in the spring using cash. He simply tightened his belt, watched the empty sky, and kept working. The heat baking off the open station of the 4010 tractor was brutal, but it was a familiar, honest misery that his father had endured before him. For Richard Miller, however, the drought was an absolute catastrophe. The blistering heat wasn't just killing his crops. It was eviscerating the massive cash flow required to feed his colossal monthly bank payments. His debt structure had been calculated on the absolute certainty of high yields and high prices. Now, the easy confidence he once wore like a tailored suit began to fray violently at the edges, replaced by an escalating, short-tempered panic. The profound difference between their two kingdoms was exposed in the dust of a scorching August afternoon. Rich's massive Steiger Bearcat, the multi-thousand-dollar pride of his fleet, suffered a catastrophic hydraulic failure while trying to pull a disc through the rock-hard, baked soil. The high-pressure circuit deep inside the complex articulated joint ruptured, contaminating the entire system. It wasn't a fix that could be done with a set of standard wrenches. The dealership had to dispatch a specialized service truck from 100 miles away. The mechanic labored for 2 days under the punishing sun, eventually presenting a staggering $10,000 bill for specialized parts and labor, a fee that cut directly into Rich's dwindling operating note. That exact same week, Jed's old Massey Ferguson developed a piercing metallic squeal in the field. Jed shut the V8 down immediately, traced the noise, and discovered that the main bearing on the cylinder drive was completely shot. He didn't call a dealer. He removed the component, drove his dusty Chevy truck into town, and tossed the greasy part onto the counter of a local supply store. The clerk took one look at it and grunted. Standard pillow block bearing. Got a dozen on the shelf. $28. 2 hours later, Jed was back in his field, the Massey running smoothly. The only cost was a bit of honest sweat and $28 cash, illustrating a timeless truth. Rich's modern strength was a fragile thoroughbred dependent on expensive specialists, while Jed's ugly, paid-for mule could survive any storm with nothing more than a hammer and common sense. The economic wind grew into a destructive gale by the autumn of 1981. The Federal Reserve, determined to break the back of national inflation, aggressively pushed interest rates to unprecedented heights. The prime rate crested at an unthinkable 21.5%. For a man like Jedodiah Stone, who owed nothing to anyone, it was just a shocking number on the evening news that had no power over his life. But for Richard Miller and thousands of modern farmers who had built their vast empires on variable rate loans, it was an absolute death sentence. The registered letters from the bank began arriving at the Miller farm weekly, each one delivering a fresh, devastating blow. The interest on Rich's massive operating notes was recalculated upward, his machinery loans were adjusted, and the mortgage on his newest land accumulated interest at a speed that made repayment mathematically impossible. His monthly obligations didn't just increase, they exploded. Concurrently, the global market collapsed. A sudden grain embargo, coupled with massive harvests overseas, caused commodity prices to plummet beneath the floor. Corn fell below $2 a bushel. The cost of borrowing money to plant a crop was now significantly higher than the actual value of the grain itself. Then came the final, cruelest blow, the complete collapse of land values. The same premium ground that had appraised for $4,000 an acre during the height of the boom struggled to fetch $1,000. Rich's paper net worth, the very foundation of his financial identity, completely evaporated. He was suddenly, terrifyingly upside down, owing millions of dollars secured by assets that were worth only a fraction of his debt. The bank, facing its own internal crisis with bad loans, turned completely cold and clinical. They called his notes, demanding immediate payment in full or forcing a total liquidation. One crisp, silent October afternoon, Jed was replacing a broken fence post along the boundary line. He looked up and saw Rich walking slowly along the edge of his home quarter, the piece of ground his grandfather had broken with a team of horses. He was no longer the confident, swaggering titan of the co-op. He looked 10 years older, his face drawn and pale, his shoulders completely slumped beneath a worn jacket. Rich stopped and stared out across the empty, harvested soil with a haunted, hollow expression of a man saying a final goodbye to his life's work. He didn't notice Jed standing there. He just stood entirely alone in the biting autumn wind, a solitary, broken figure on the edge of a collapsing world. The morning of the Miller foreclosure auction arrived on a grim, gray day in mid-November. A bitter, driving wind swept across the barren fields, carrying with it the cold scent of rain and absolute ruin. The crowd that gathered in the yard was even larger than the one that had witnessed the Peterson sale years before, but the atmosphere was completely different. There was no competitive energy, no thrill of the bargain hunt. Instead, a profound collective sorrow hung over the neighbors. They stood in quiet, solemn clusters, recognizing in Rich Miller's sudden fall a terrifying reflection of their own vulnerability. Jedodiah Stone stood near the very back of the crowd, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his heavy canvas coat. He watched in silence as the auctioneer began to dismantle Rich's life piece by piece. The giant Steiger tractor, the gleaming luxury combines, the trucks, and the tools were all sold off for scrap prices, scattered to the four winds for pennies on the dollar. Rich stood beside his wife near the door of their brick house, looking like a ghost at his own funeral, his face a pale mask of utter disbelief. Finally, the auctioneer turned to the land, quickly disposing of the expansion parcels to an investment group. Then came the final lot, the original 160 acres of the Miller family homestead. The bankers started the bidding at a brutally low $500 an acre just to cover the remaining scraps of the primary mortgage. A heavy, painful silence fell over the local farmers. No one wanted to profit from a neighbor's absolute displacement. Sensing an easy victory, an outside land speculator from the city casually called out a bid of $550, then pushed it to $600, moving to steal the ancestral farm for a pittance. Rich's wife buried her face in her husband's shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. It was in that exact moment of despair that Jed moved forward through the crowd. "800, Jed called out, his voice ringing clear and steady against the wind. The speculator, annoyed, instantly shot back, $850. 1,000. Jed countered without a single second of hesitation. A collective gasp went through the crowd. This was real money, backed by the solid cash reserves Jed had accumulated through years of frugal living and the hard work of his resurrected Massey combine. The speculator looked at the absolute, unyielding determination in Jed's eyes, realized he could not be beaten, and stepped back. The gavel fell with a sharp, final crack. Jed didn't celebrate. He walked straight across the gravel to where Rich stood shattered and broken. Rich looked up, his eyes filled with deep shame and confusion. "Why, Jed? After everything I said, I called you a fool." Jed looked at the old Miller barn, then back at his neighbor. No man should ever have to watch his ancestral home sold off to a stranger, Rich. This ground belongs to your family. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and placed it in Rich's trembling hand. It's a blank rental agreement. You stay right here in the house, and you farm this soil for a fair share of the crop using whatever equipment you have left. We'll figure out a way for you to buy it back from me when you're standing on your feet again. Rich stared at the paper, then at Jed, as tears of shattering humility finally welled in his eyes. The man he had ridiculed for years had just offered him absolute grace. Years turned into decades, and the bitter winter storms of the 1980s gradually gave way to a gentler era of quiet cooperation. Life settled into a new, humble rhythm across the valley. Jedodiah Stone grew old, his hair turning the soft color of winter wheat and his hands becoming deeply gnarled maps of his long agricultural journey. He never accumulated immense wealth, and he never bought a shiny, brand-new tractor, but his light stayed on, his soil remained secure, and he was regarded by his neighbors with a deep-seated respect that money could never purchase. True to his word, he eventually sold the homestead back to a restored, deeply grateful Rich Miller for the exact price he had paid at the auction. On a warm afternoon in the late 1990s, Jed stood inside the dim shade of the machine shed alongside his adult son, Tom, who had recently returned from college. Tom was looking over a glossy equipment brochure, talking rapidly about securing a large bank loan to purchase a modern, high-tech combine equipped with satellite tracking and a climate control cab. Jed listened in silence, his eyes drifting over to the far corner of the barn, where the retired Massey Ferguson 760 sat in a permanent place of honor. Its mismatched red and gray paint was faded, and its riveted steel patches stood out like battle scars from a war for survival. Jed placed a heavy, reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, looking from the high-tech brochure back to the old iron giant. He remembered the freezing nights in the dirt floor shed, the smell of chemical oil, the sound of the Perkins V8 roaring to life against the world, and the absolute liberty of standing on paid-for ground while the empires of debt collapsed around him. "Let me tell you an important story, son," Jed began, his voice raspy with age, but carrying the unyielding weight of bedrock truth. "It's about this old machine, and what things are truly worth in this life. There's a vast generational difference between being rich and being entirely free." As the afternoon sun filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating the old combine like a relic in a quiet cathedral, the father passed down the true family inheritance, a lesson paid for an honest sweat and ridicule, proving that the strongest foundations are never built on debt, but on patience, self-reliance, and the wisdom to know when you already have enough. If this journey of resilience and quiet wisdom touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share this story with someone who appreciates the timeless value of an honest, independent life.